Story 1: The Man Who Knew Your Name. The fire crackled and spat embers into the cool autumn air, its orange glow casting long, flickering shadows across the circle of campers. The woods were quiet, too quiet. No crickets chirped, no owls hooted, and the wind seemed to hold its breath. It was the kind of silence that made your skin crawl, the kind that made you feel like you were being watched. But the 5 friends around the fire laughed and joked, oblivious to the unease creeping into the edges of their minds. "Pass me another marshmallow, Jess," said Mike. His voice slurred from the beer he'd been nursing for the past hour. Jess rolled her eyes but tossed him the bag. She was the practical one, the one who always packed extra supplies and made sure everyone stayed hydrated. Across from her, Tyler strummed his guitar lazily, his fingers picking out a tune that didn't quite match the mood of the night. Beside him, Sarah and Ethan were locked in a whispered conversation, their heads close together, their laughter soft and private. They'd chosen this spot because it was remote, far from the noise and chaos of the city. No cell service, no distractions. Just the 5 of them, the fire, and the endless expanse of trees. It was supposed to be a weekend of bonding, of forgetting the stresses of their lives. But the woods had other plans. The first sign that something was wrong came just after 10 p.m. The sound of footsteps crunching through the underbrush made them all freeze. Tyler's guitar fell silent, and Mike sat up straighter, his hand instinctively reaching for the flashlight at his side. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and accompanied by a low, guttural muttering that sent a chill down Jess's spine. "Hello," Mike called out, his voice wavering slightly. "Who's there?" The muttering stopped, and for a moment, there was only silence. Then, from the darkness beyond the firelight, a figure emerged. It was an old man, his face gaunt and lined with deep wrinkles, his eyes sunken and shadowed. He wore a tattered flannel shirt and jeans that hung loosely on his thin frame. His hair was a wild tangle of gray, and his breath came in short, ragged gasps, as though he'd been running for miles. "You shouldn't be here," the old man croaked, his voice trembling. They're coming, and you're not safe." The campers exchanged uneasy glances. Jess was the first to speak. "Who's coming? What are you talking about?" The old man staggered closer to the fire, his eyes darting around the circle as though searching for something or someone. "You don't understand," he said, his voice rising in pitch. "They know your names. They know everything about you. You have to leave. Now." Mike stood up, his flashlight trained on the old man. "Look, buddy, you're freaking us out. Why don't you sit down, have a drink, and tell us what's going on?" The old man shook his head violently. No time. They're coming, and when they get here, it'll be too late." He pointed a bony finger at Mike. "You're Mike, aren't you? Mike Anderson. Born July 12, 1992. You're afraid of the dark, but you'd never admit it." Mike's face paled. "How do you know that?" The old man turned to Jess. "Jessica Morales. You're the responsible one, always looking out for everyone else. But you have secrets, don't you? Things you've never told anyone." Jess's mouth went dry. "Stop it." The old man's gaze shifted to Tyler. "Tyler Reed, you think you're the life of the party, but deep down you're terrified of being alone. And you," he pointed at Sarah and Ethan. "Sarah Collins and Ethan Gray. You're in love, but you're both too scared to say it." The campers stared at him, their unease turning to outright fear. How could this stranger know so much about them? It wasn't possible. "Who are you?" Sarah asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The old man ignored her question. "You have to leave," he said again, his voice desperate. "Before midnight. If you're still here when they come, you'll wish you'd never been born." "Who's coming?" Ethan demanded, his voice shaking. "What are you talking about?" The old man's eyes widened, and he took a step back, his gaze fixed on something in the distance. "They're here," he whispered. "Oh God, they're here." The campers followed his gaze, but there was nothing there, just the endless darkness of the woods. When they turned back, the old man was gone. "What the hell just happened?" Mike asked, his voice trembling. "I don't know," Jess said, her mind racing. But we need to figure it out. Fast. They spent the next hour debating what to do. Mike wanted to leave immediately, but Jess argued that it was too dangerous to hike out in the dark. Tyler suggested they stay put and keep the fire going, while Sarah and Ethan huddled together, their faces pale with fear. As the minutes ticked by, the tension in the air grew thicker. The woods seemed to close in around them, the trees looming like silent sentinels. The fire, once a source of warmth and comfort, now felt like a beacon, drawing something toward them. At 11:45 p.m., the old man returned. He stumbled into the campsite, his face twisted in terror. "You didn't leave," he said, his voice breaking. "Why didn't you leave?" "We couldn't," Jess said, her voice firm despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "Now tell us what's going on. Who's coming?" The old man opened his mouth to answer, but before he could speak, the fire suddenly flared, its flames leaping higher than ever before. The campers scrambled back, their eyes wide with terror as the fire began to twist and writhe, forming shapes that looked almost human. And then the screaming started. It was the old man. He was on his knees, his hands clawing at his face as he let out a blood-curdling scream. But it wasn't a scream of fear. It was a scream of hunger. His eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and his mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, revealing rows of jagged, yellow teeth. "They're here," he hissed, his voice no longer human. "And now, so am I." The campers watched in horror as the old man's body began to change. His limbs elongated, his fingers turning into claws. His skin stretched and tore, revealing something dark and monstrous beneath. And then he lunged. Mike was the first to die. The old man, or whatever he had become, sank his claws into Mike's chest, tearing him apart with terrifying ease. Jess screamed and grabbed the nearest weapon she could find, a burning log from the fire, and swung it at the creature. It howled in pain but didn't stop. Tyler tried to run, but the creature was faster. It caught him by the leg and dragged him back, its claws slicing through his flesh like butter. Sarah and Ethan clung to each other, their screams echoing through the woods as the creature turned its attention to them. Jess knew she was next. She backed away, her heart pounding in her chest as the creature advanced. But just as it was about to strike, the fire flared again, and a voice, deep and resonant, boomed through the night. "Enough!" The creature froze, its head snapping toward the fire. The flames parted, and a figure stepped out. A man, tall and imposing, with eyes that burned like coals. He raised a hand, and the creature let out a final, ear-splitting scream before collapsing into a heap of ash. The man turned to Jess, his expression unreadable. "You should have left when you had the chance," he said, his voice heavy with regret. "But it's too late now. They know your names. They'll never stop coming." And then he was gone, leaving Jess alone in the darkness, surrounded by the bodies of her friends. The fire died down, and the woods fell silent once more. But Jess knew the silence wouldn't last. They were out there watching, waiting, and they knew her name. The story ends with Jess sitting by the ashes of the fire, her mind racing with fear and guilt. She knows she should run, but where can she go? The woods are endless, and they're always watching. And when the fire flares again, she knows it's only a matter of time before they come for her. The man who knew your name is gone, but his warning lingers in the air, a chilling reminder that some secrets are better left buried, and some names should never be spoken. Story 2: The Shadow in the Smoke. The fire was dying. Its embers glowed faintly, casting a weak, flickering light over the small clearing in the woods. The air was thick with the scent of pine and burning wood, and the smoke curled upward in lazy spirals, disappearing into the starless sky. Around the fire sat 4 friends: Mark, the de facto leader; Lisa, the skeptic; Greg, the joker; and Emily, the quiet one. They had been laughing and telling stories for hours, but now, as the fire dimmed, a strange silence settled over them. It was Greg who noticed him first. "Hey, guys," Greg said, his voice uncharacteristically hesitant. "We've got company." The others turned to see an old man standing at the edge of the firelight. He was tall and thin, his face gaunt and lined with deep wrinkles. His hair was a wild tangle of gray, and his eyes, milky and unfocused, seemed to stare right through them. He wore a tattered coat that hung loosely on his frame, and his hands trembled as he clutched a walking stick. "You shouldn't be here," the old man said, his voice low and gravelly. "Not tonight." Mark stood up, his instincts kicking in. "Hey man, we're just camping. We're not causing any trouble." The old man shook his head slowly. "It's not about trouble. It's about the smoke." He pointed a bony finger at the fire. "Don't stare into it. Not for too long. The smoke, it shows you things. Things you can't unsee." Lisa rolled her eyes. "Great. Another creepy old guy with a cryptic warning. What's next? Don't split up in the woods? Don't answer the phone after midnight." The old man's milky eyes fixed on her, and for a moment, Lisa felt a chill run down her spine. "Laugh if you want," he said, "but you've been warned." With that, he turned and disappeared into the darkness, leaving the four friends staring after him. "Well, that was weird," Greg said, breaking the silence. "What do you think he meant about the smoke?" "Probably nothing," Lisa said, though her voice lacked its usual confidence. "Just some old guy trying to scare us." Mark sat back down, his eyes on the fire. "Maybe, but let's not take any chances. We'll keep the fire low and stay close." Emily, who had been silent until now, spoke up. "What if he's right? What if the smoke shows us something?" Greg grinned. "Only one way to find out." He leaned forward, staring intently into the smoke. "Come on, smoke. Show me the future. Show me next week's lottery numbers." Lisa laughed, but Mark and Emily exchanged uneasy glances. There was something about the old man's warning that lingered, like a bad taste in the back of their throats. Hours passed, and the fire burned lower. The friends tried to keep the mood light, but the old man's words hung over them like a dark cloud. Eventually, exhaustion took over, and one by one, they drifted off to sleep, all except Greg. Greg couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him. He sat by the fire, poking at the embers with a stick, his eyes occasionally darting to the edge of the clearing. The old man's warning echoed in his mind, and against his better judgment, he found himself staring into the smoke. First, there was nothing, just the usual swirls and patterns. But then, something shifted. The smoke seemed to thicken, forming shapes that weren't there before. Greg leaned closer, his heart pounding in his chest. He saw a face, no, not a face, a shadow. It was faint at first, but as he stared, it grew clearer. It was the old man, his milky eyes staring back at Greg from within the smoke. Greg blinked, convinced it was a trick of the light. But when he looked again, the shadow was still there. And it wasn't alone. Behind the old man, another figure loomed, tall and dark, its features indistinct but undeniably menacing. Greg's breath caught in his throat as the shadow turned its head, its hollow eyes locking onto his. "Guys," Greg whispered, his voice trembling. "Guys, wake up." No one stirred. Greg tore his eyes away from the smoke and looked around the campsite. Mark, Lisa, and Emily were all asleep, their breathing slow and steady. When he looked back at the fire, the smoke had cleared. The shadows were gone. But something was wrong. The old man was gone too. Greg was sure of it. He had been standing at the edge of the clearing just moments ago. But now there was no sign of him. And then Greg saw it, a movement at the edge of the firelight. A shadow, tall and dark, standing just beyond the trees. Greg's heart raced as he grabbed his flashlight and shone it toward the shadow. The beam of light cut through the darkness, but there was nothing there, just trees and underbrush. He lowered the flashlight, his hands shaking, and that's when he heard it. A low, guttural whisper, like the sound of wind through dead leaves. "Greg!" He froze. The voice was coming from the fire. He turned back to the embers, his stomach churning, and saw the smoke rising again. This time it formed a single word, clear as day. "Run." The next morning, Greg was gone. Mark, Lisa, and Emily searched the campsite and the surrounding woods, but there was no trace of him. His sleeping bag was still there, his backpack propped against a tree, but Greg himself had vanished. "This doesn't make any sense," Mark said, running a hand through his hair. "He wouldn't just leave. Not without saying something." Lisa frowned. What if it has something to do with that old guy? The one who warned us about the smoke." Emily shuddered. "I don't like this. I don't like this at all." They decided to pack up and head back to town. But as they doused the fire, Emily noticed something strange. The smoke from the dying embers seemed to linger, forming shapes that made her stomach turn. She saw Greg's face, twisted in terror, and behind him, the shadowy figure from the night before. "We need to leave. Now," Emily said, her voice trembling. But it was too late. As they shouldered their packs and turned to leave, they heard it. The same low, guttural whisper that Greg had heard the night before. It came from the trees, from the fire, from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Mark, Lisa, Emily. They froze, their blood turning to ice. And then they saw it, the shadow standing at the edge of the clearing, its hollow eyes fixed on them. The search party found the campsite 3 days later. The fire had long since burned out, and the only signs of the friends were their abandoned gear and a single word scrawled in the ashes: "Run." Story 3: The Old Man in the Woods. The woods were alive with the sounds of night, crickets chirping, leaves rustling, and the occasional hoot of an owl. The fire crackled and popped, casting a warm, golden glow over the circle of friends gathered around it. There were 6 of them: Jake, the ringleader; Claire, the skeptic; Ryan, the joker; Mia, the artist; Ben, the quiet one; and Emma, the newcomer. They had come to these woods for a weekend of camping, bonding, and escaping the chaos of their lives. But the woods had other plans. It started with a story. "All right, who's got the scariest campfire story?" Jake asked, leaning back in his camping chair with a grin. "And I'm not talking about, the call is coming from inside the house crap. I want something that'll make me sleep with the lights on." Ryan raised his hand. "I've got one. It's about this old man who shows up at campfires in the woods. He tells this story about how he got lost out here years ago and was hunted by something that wore the faces of his friends. And then, when he finishes the story, he just disappears." Claire rolled her eyes. "Sounds like every other campfire story ever. What's the twist? He's actually a ghost? Or maybe he's the thing that hunted his friends?" Ryan shrugged. "I don't know. I heard it from some guy at a bar. But it's creepy, right?" Before anyone could respond, a voice came from the darkness. "It's not just a story." The group froze, their eyes darting toward the edge of the firelight. Standing there was an old man, his face gaunt and lined with deep wrinkles. He wore a tattered flannel shirt and jeans that hung loosely on his thin frame. His hair was a wild tangle of gray, and his eyes, pale and watery, seemed to stare right through them. "Mind if I join you?" the old man asked, his voice low and gravelly. Jake exchanged a glance with the others before nodding. Sure. Have a seat." The old man shuffled into the circle and sat down on a log, his hands trembling as he held them out to the fire. For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the crackling of the flames and the distant hoot of an owl. "You were talking about the old man in the woods," the old man said, his eyes fixed on the fire. "That's me." The group exchanged uneasy glances. Claire opened her mouth to say something, but Jake shook his head, his curiosity piqued. "Go on," Jake said. "Tell us your story." The old man took a deep breath and began. "It was 50 years ago. I was young then, just like you. Me and my friends, Tom, Sarah, and Mike. We came out here for a weekend of camping. We were having a great time, just like you are now. But then, something happened. We were sitting around the fire, telling stories, when we heard something in the woods. It sounded like footsteps, but they were wrong. Too heavy, too slow. We called out, but no one answered. Then, out of the trees came a figure. It looked like a man, but its face kept changing. One moment it was Tom, the next it was Sarah, then Mike. It was like it was wearing their faces. We tried to run, but it was fast. Too fast. Caught Tom first. We heard him screaming, but when we turned back, it wasn't Tom anymore. It was the thing wearing his face. Came after us one by one. Sarah, then Mike. I was the only one who got away. I've been out here ever since, warning people, but no one ever listens. And every time I finish my story, I disappear. Because the truth is, I'm not really here. I'm still out there, running from that thing. And it's still hunting me. The old man fell silent, his eyes still fixed on the fire. The group stared at him, their faces pale with fear. Even Claire, the skeptic, looked shaken. That's a good story, Jake said, his voice trembling slightly. But it's just a story, right? The old man didn't respond. He just stood up, his movements slow and deliberate, and walked into the trees. The group watched him go, their hearts pounding in their chests. What the hell was that? Mia asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know, Jake said, but I don't like it. They spent the rest of the night huddled around the fire, jumping at every sound. When morning came, they packed up their gear and left, vowing never to come back to those woods. But the woods weren't done with them. A year later, Jake and his friends decided to go camping again. This time, they chose a different spot, a secluded clearing deep in the woods. They told themselves it was just for fun, but deep down, they all knew the truth. They wanted to see if the old man would show up again. He did. It was the same as before. The old man appeared at the edge of the firelight, his tattered flannel shirt and watery eyes unmistakable. He told the same story, word for word, and then disappeared into the trees. This time, the group was more shaken than ever. They left the woods the next morning, swearing they would never return. But they did. Year after year, they came back to the woods, drawn by some unseen force. And every time, the old man was there, telling his story and then vanishing. It became a ritual, a dark tradition that they couldn't explain. Until one year, everything changed. It was their 10th trip to the woods. The group was older now, their faces lined with age and their hair streaked with gray. But the old man was the same as ever. His tattered flannel shirt, his watery eyes, his trembling hands. He told his story just like always. But this time, when he finished, he didn't disappear. He just stood there, staring at them with a strange, almost sad expression. You've been coming here for 10 years, the old man said. Why? The group exchanged uneasy glances. They had never told him about their yearly trips. How did he know? We don't know, Jake admitted. We just keep coming back. The old man nodded, as if he had expected that answer. It's the woods, he said. They call to you, just like they called to me. And then, for the first time, the old man smiled. But it wasn't a friendly smile. It was the smile of a predator. You see, he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. I'm not the one who's been hunting you. I'm the bait. Before anyone could react, the old man's face began to change. His features twisted and shifted, becoming something dark and monstrous. His eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and his mouth stretched into a grotesque grin, revealing rows of jagged, yellow teeth. The group screamed and scrambled to their feet, but it was too late. The thing that had been the old man lunged, its claws slicing through the air. One by one, it took them: Jake, Claire, Ryan, Mia, Ben, and Emma. Their screams echoed through the woods, but there was no one to hear them. The search party found the campsite 3 days later. The fire had long since burned out, and the only signs of the group were their abandoned gear and a single word scrawled in the ashes: run.